in church, and the average age of somebody at St Thomas's is in the mid-20s, so it's been quite a journey, and I'll tell us a little bit about us as we go on. Now, to tell the story of St Thomas's properly, I feel like I need to start several centuries ago. So, we titled this talk, Proclaiming the Gospel Afresh in Each Generation, which, for those of you Anglicans in the room, is of course a line from the ordinal that is spoken over deacons and priests as they're ordained. We're reminded that we're to proclaim afresh the gospel in each generation. And we're hoping and praying by the grace of God that is what's happening at St Thomas's now. But of course we're aware that we're just joining in with what God has already been doing for a long time. So I'll briefly tell the story of St Thomas's through history, and then a little bit about where we're at now, and then, as Max said, maybe some time for questions. So, it's the 12th century, the early 12th century. Henry II is on the throne, and he has a friend who he wants to be Archbishop of Canterbury. His friend is Thomas Becket, who was his chancellor, and Henry thinks that the way to control the church and the state, if you can control everything, then that's good news for him. And so he thinks, I'll put my friend on the Archbishop's throne and it will all be good. And there's a problem with this in that Thomas Becket wasn't ordained. And obviously that's a slight problem if you want to be an archbishop. And so Thomas was sent to a little town called Beverley in East Yorkshire, which is where I was born, where I grew up for 18 years. And Thomas was vicar of Beverley Minster for a very short time, I think under a year. I was a chorister at Beverley Minster growing up, so there's a bit of a Beverley connection, which you'll see as we go through this story. So Thomas was vicar of Beverley Minster for a very short amount of time, and then was made Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, some of you I know have been involved in productions in about Thomas Becket's life, Murder in the Cathedral at St Thomas's. And so forgive me if I'm telling you this story and you already know it already, but to cut a long story short, Thomas and the king, Henry II, very quickly fell out. Thomas could not do what Henry was asking. This is, you read about this in history books, but Thomas basically said, I can do nothing but what God and the Lord Jesus requires me to do. I can't do what you ask. And Thomas had to flee to France because the king was after him. He eventually came back to England and was in the cathedral at Canterbury. The king heard about this and very famously sent some knights to give him an opportunity to either, forget his foolish ways, or they'd kill him where he was, haul him out onto the streets of Canterbury and kill him. And you know the story. Thomas refused to do that, and these 4 knights killed him while he was saying evening prayer. Literally chopped off his head and took it out into the streets. A few years after this, the king, Henry II, had a very public repentance of this particular sin that he committed in the cathedral. And again, just to cut the story short, the king ended up going on pilgrimage to Canterbury, and his act of penance for this crime that he committed was that he sent the knights that killed Thomas up to a little town called Newcastle-upon-Tyne to start a church in his name. And so St Thomas's has existed since the 1170s in Newcastle. The current building has been there since 1827. But originally there's been a St Thomas's continuously since the 1170s. Thomas Becket, as you know, fairly quickly had a bit of a cult following all over the place. He was very quickly canonised by the Pope. Maybe for just sticking on to the King of England, I don't know why. And very quickly there was a bit of a cult following. In the early medieval time, by the 12th, 13th century, Newcastle had become a very popular place for pilgrimage. And St Thomas's at the time was located, for those of you that know Newcastle, was located by the Swing Bridge, so right down on the quayside. And there's a street still to this day in Newcastle city centre called Pilgrim Street, you know, the main street that runs up from the river through the city centre. It's called Pilgrim Street because so many pilgrims were coming to Newcastle to pray. All of these hotels sprung up on Pilgrim Street, hence why it's called Pilgrim Street. St Thomas's was obviously down at the bottom of this street. And so all of these pilgrims were coming to Newcastle. They'd often stop and pray at St Thomas's. They'd stay on Pilgrim Street, and then they would walk up the hill to somewhere just outside of the city centre as it was then. And the reason that people were doing that, they were walking to the Mews bed. The reason that people were doing that was because there were all of these stories of people encountering Jesus by this river. And this river became a place for lots of baptisms, lots of religious Christian celebrations. People were reporting that they were miraculously healed there. And the place was so known for this, it became known as the Mound of Jesus, or Jesus' Mound. Today, that's shortened and conflated to Jesmond. So, if you walk through Jesmond Dean, there's an old chapel that still stands there. It's a bit derelict now, but St Mary's Chapel, which dates, I think, from the 13th, 14th century. That was erected to commemorate this particular move of God, and that was happening on Jesus' Mount, Jesmond, today. Anyway, there's lots of people visiting St Thomas's around this time. And it became a fairly influential church from what we can tell. Fast forward a few centuries now, and we're in the time of John Wesley. And John Wesley steps off his horse and carriage upon arriving in Newcastle-upon-Tyne, and he famously remarks about the filthy language of the people and the drunkenness of the people of the city, and he even talked about the filthy language that came even out of the mouth of babes. And he famously remarks that despite all of that, never has a place been so ripe for revival. Fast forward a few decades now, so we're in the early 1800s, and St Thomas's, which is still at this time down on the quayside, has fallen into a complete state of neglect. Floods, possibly the fire, I don't know, but the building was it really in a bad way and needed some repair. But not only was the building in a bad way, but the congregation was fairly neglected as well. And the historic records show that there was just a handful of people now worshipping at St Thomas's. Around that time, 2 Anglican ministers are appointed to oversee the ministry at St Thomas's and the hospital, so St Mary Magdalene Hospital. So St Thomas's always had a connection with that particular thing. 2 guys called Richard Clayton and Robert Wozni. These 2 men arrived. Wozni was older than Clayton. In fact, Wozni was described by Clayton as his father in the faith, so I think had led him somehow to a conversion and was responsible for his particular ministry. But they arrived, and one of the first things that they did was that they knew that they had to move the church from the quayside up towards the city centre. So they had to oversee a building project, and so they had to raise some money and move the church. And they hired a little-known architect at the time called John Dobson. This was, for those of you that are Dobson fans, obviously built most of the modern city centre, the train station, all Grey Street, all of that. St Thomas's was the first church that he built. And the reason that they moved it up from the quayside to the Haymarket is because they could see the centre of gravity was moving that way. And around the time, there's a plaque that's in my office at the church that talks about this. They picked the Haymarket because of all of the families and children and young people that were living around them, and they saw this opportunity to reach children and young people with the good news of Jesus. And so anyway, they oversee this building project, and they begin preaching the gospel. And within a few years, St Thomas's has grown from just a handful of people in the if you look at the service registers, to by the 1840s, I think 1849, the average attendance at St Thomas's was 2,396 on a Sunday. We're just under, average attendance of under 18s that year was 897. Now, I knew all of this when arriving at St Thomas's, some of that history, but some of the stuff that I found out since then is completely mind-blowing. So Robert Wodsney, who was one of the ministers, there's a plaque that's dedicated to him that's above our communion table at St Thomas's. And he was born in a little town in East Yorkshire called Beverley. Was educated in his theology at Cambridge. And this plaque that stands there is basically, I'll tell you a little bit more about it actually in a minute. But he's from Beverley. They also arrived at a time when Newcastle was effectively in a lockdown. So I was reading a history book about some of the religious history of Newcastle. And obviously we arrived 3 years ago, 4 months after having our first service at St Thomas's. There was the pandemic and a lockdown. And I was reading some historical descriptions of Newcastle in the 1830s, where there was a pandemic of cholera, I think. And these descriptions of the city streets read like this: the place came to a standstill. The place had a deserted appearance. Tradespeople didn't leave their homes. Trade came to a standstill, and doctors were overwhelmed by their job. The hearse met you at every corner. On every face was the depiction of gloom. And yet at St Thomas's during that time they kept open, preaching the gospel, serving the poor. Thousands were saved. Anyway, on this plaque that stands above the communion table at St Thomas's, it talks about how these guys were committed to serving the poor, resourcing mission and ministry beyond the four walls of the church, how they were committed to evangelical truth and inculcating it upon their hearers with irresistible effect, which is one of my favourite lines. And then it ends, this plaque ends with a prayer. And it's extraordinary. It basically says, and the congregation of this place erect this plaque in the firm and fervent hope that an example like this will be followed in a generation to come.
No pressure.
No. So that's a little bit of the history of St Thomas's. Now when we arrived 3 years ago, and Vance had asked me to talk about this in particular, the average attendance at St Thomas's, some wonderful, wonderful people. Average attendance was about 7 or 8 people on a Sunday. I got a phone call in November 2017 from Bishop Christine, who was then the Bishop of Newcastle. She's recently retired, asking me if I would take a team from the church that I was at in York, St Michael Belfry in the city centre, and bring some people to start a new church, resource church for the Diocese of Newcastle. And so we began to talk about this with our church family in York, and about 30 people, including a handful of children, committed to moving 96 miles north from York to Newcastle to start this new church. At the time, we didn't know where it was going to be. For those of you that have followed the journey, at one point it was going to be at All Saints on the quayside, and we've ended up at St Thomas's, which is a whole story in itself. And I've got to say that in my own leadership, I think the hardest thing I've ever done, and the biggest weight of responsibility I've felt, is for those people that moved with us from York to Newcastle and had just landed here, and then the pandemic hit. Feeling the weight of response. I know I shouldn't, as God takes it, but feeling the weight of responsibility for their children as they've moved them out of schools in York and have struggled to find schools in Newcastle, or for people that have moved and have, before they've even found a job here. That was, for those people, I think I've learned so much about the radical call of following Jesus wherever it is that he calls us to go. And their model of sacrificial discipleship has been really inspiring. So anyway, we arrived at St Thomas's. The place was in a bit of a mess physically. I remember working in the vestry and 2 rats ran across my foot. The place was really drafty and a bit cluttered and in a really bad way physically. And so during the pandemic, as Max has said, we started a reordering project, and we opened for the first time last Sunday. It's been 14 months overdue. It was supposed to take 9 months and then ended up taking the best part of 2 years. But it is beautiful now inside. We basically returned it to how it was originally built. We've taken out all of the Victorian interventions which cluttered up the space and made it make no sense. We flattened the galleries, which were put in 4 years after the church was originally built, just to cope with all of the growth. They couldn't fit everybody in, so they had to quickly build these galleries to sit 800 people just to fit everybody in. So we flattened them off. We've sealed the arches that separate the galleries from the main space with this thick acoustically sealed glass to create 2 large meeting rooms, and we put some meeting rooms in downstairs. But the best thing about the newly reordered St Thomas's is that we've got this beautiful font that stands that sits in the middle of the church. And I think it's the first font of its kind. It's certainly in the Northern Province. So it's right in the middle of the sanctuary, of the nave. And it's probably from where I am to where Max is in length. And there's these steps. It's kind of blue tiled, marble surround, glass thing, and it's dug in the shape of a Celtic cross into the floor, and it's lit up from from underneath, so you can see the shape of the thing. And when you see this thing, it's got steps that are going down, then this big pool, and steps that come out the other way. And in gold writing around it, we've got Romans 6 verse 4, which says, "Do you not know that in your baptism you were buried with Christ in his death, and in his resurrection raised to new life, to the glory of God the Father?" Amen. And it's just this beautiful, it really is a stunning work it's a work of art, liturgical art, as well as a place to baptise people. We baptised 3 babies in there last Sunday, fully dunked them. And it's fantastic. The reason that we wanted that right at the centre of the church, it's kind of in the centre of the nave, but at the start of the worship area. So again, for those of you Anglicans, you know that the font is especially the first thing that you see when you enter the space, because it's symbolic of the start of your journey of Christian discipleship. The reason that we wanted it right there was to proclaim the good news that Jesus is Lord, and that regardless of who you are, or where you've come from, or your life story, there's hope for you, and you can be joined in with Jesus' death and resurrection. We opened early, partly because of the Queen's death. We've been open every single day since two Thursdays ago, nearly all day, every day. And the amount of people have walked, thousands of people have walked into the church and have seen this thing right in the middle of the floor, the amount of conversations that it starts, it's just extraordinary. What is that? Why is it there? All of those kinds of things. And so do be praying with us that we'll see many people baptised. We've seen a lot of students and young adults baptised over the past 3 years. Bishop Christine has come to do quite a few of them with me, and it's just been an extraordinary journey. This past week we bought a wood-fired pizza oven that lives outside the front of the church. So for those of you who know the location of the church, it's right opposite Newcastle University. This past week has been Freshers Week, and so we just have to light up this pizza oven. And you get a queue of students from our front door to Northumberland Street. We gave out 1,600 pizzas last week.
There's one pizza.
1,600 quarters of pizza. And it's a real gift because all these students queue up. They know they're getting free pizza from the church. You've got a captive audience. You've got this line of students that aren't going to go anywhere. No one's left the queue yet. And we get to invite every single one of them to come and try church. And some of the conversations that we've had over the past week have just been extraordinary. People that have never stepped foot in a church before, but get chatting to somebody from the church family. And there's two girls in particular who fourth year master students. Never been to church before, ended up having a slice of pizza, came into the church for a free tea and coffee, ended up sitting next to me. I was chatting to them for an hour, and they were just in tears as I was sharing with them the story of Jesus and the gospel. And so the opportunities that we have are just extraordinary at St Thomas's. It's not always been a straightforward journey, and it's not always been easy. In fact, there's been some very difficult moments along the way. 3 years ago, just before we had our first ever Sunday, which was the 6th of October 2019, I was doing my mother-in-law's funeral just a few days before we had our first service, and lots of the team that moved from York have all have been through similar things, hardships and troubles. It's not always been a straightforward journey. The building project is overrun. We've had the pandemic, which was a whole thing in itself, but obviously forced us to stream all of that content online, and that was extraordinary as well. Just seeing people that have never been in church before watching a live stream, and we've baptised a number of people who became Christians while watching just an online service. It's not always been easy, but God has been very good, and we feel like in some ways that we're just getting going. For the last year and a half, all of the staff team have been working from the vicarage, so every morning at 9 o'clock it's open the door and 13, 14 people arrive for morning prayer. And our dining room gets turned into an office every day of the week, and then we turn it back into a dining room for the evening. So in some ways it feels like we're just arriving. Even though we're 3 years in, it feels like we've just got the home that we knew that we'd always get. It's just 3 years late. But what it does show, I'll end here, is that you don't need a fancy building. And it's not about resources or a nice building. God can work anywhere, in any circumstance, through any people, if we proclaim the gospel afresh in each generation. The day that I was licensed as Master of St Thomas's, Bishop Christine preached on Isaiah 40. And for those of you that know Isaiah 43 says, forget the former things. Do you not see I'm doing a new thing? And God has done some wonderful things in this region and in the city of Newcastle before. And if He's done them before, He can do them again. Amen. And it's not my job to change the gospel message. We don't do that. It's just we're called to proclaim it afresh, so that we can see that the God who's done amazing things in the past, He can do them again in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm sure there's going to be some questions that people want to ask you. I'll just start off with the first one, which doesn't address quite what you've been talking about, a resource church, which is meant to serve the whole diocese in some way. Can you just unpack that a tiny bit for us?
Yes. In some ways the title Resource Church should never have been used, but here we are, it's been used. So a Resource Church, according to the Church of England, so it's a national strategy. So again, for those of you that are Anglicans, you've probably heard about this through National General Synod or the Church Times or wherever it is that you get your Anglican news. The Archbishop of Canterbury has released quite a bit of Church Commissioners' money to start new churches, particularly in towns and cities where there's a high proportion of young people. And so, again, I'm sure you know this, but Newcastle has one of the highest, if not the highest, concentration of 20-something-year-olds of any city in the country. So Newcastle is the opposite to the national age demographic trend. So if you were to break Newcastle down into 5-year age categories, the single biggest age category is 19 to 24-year-olds, then 25 to 29-year-olds, then 0 to 4s, then 15 to 19-year-olds, then 35 to 39-year-olds or something. So it's a very young city, partly because there's 70,000 students in the city, and as you know, lots of them don't leave. When they arrive, lots of them stay. And so a resource church is to reach people the Church of England is currently not reaching. So you'll know that the average age of a church in the Church of England is way, way above what St Thomas's is at the minute. I think it's 68, 69 or something. So that's one thing. The second thing is that a resource church exists to start new worshipping communities, so effectively to plant churches across the region that it's serving. And so over time, our hope and prayer working with the diocese is that we'll plant lots of new churches that will reach people that we're currently not reaching across the diocese. Some people have struggled with that idea, with the concept of starting new churches. And what I often say to people is, well, just look at the region that we're in. The whole of the north of England and beyond was evangelised, and churches were planted from this particular region. That was the whole reason for Holy Island. And I often say to people, how do you think, the church that you worship in, how do you think it got there? Do you think it just suddenly appeared overnight? Or somebody made the decision to start it, usually with a team, moving somewhere to start a new church. In Newcastle itself, there was a huge period of very rapid church planting in the Victorian era. Every church was planted once, and we're just at a stage now where we need to continue to plant new churches and start new worshiping communities. Just one quick statistic as to why we need to do this. In the diocese, the population is about 837,000 people live in the diocese of Newcastle. The diocese stretches from the Tyne River up to the Scottish border and across towards the lakes, towards Cumbria. Average attendance on a Sunday is about 13,000 out of 837,000 people. So that's a picture locally. Nationally, only 3% of under 30-year-olds go to church.
Any church?
Any church, yeah. This is 18 to 30-year-olds, 3%. And half of all of the young adults that go to church in the UK go to church within inside the M25. So that's 1.5% if you take London out of the equation. And so we need to do something to proclaim the gospel afresh to each generation. And so Resource Church is a church that's going to do that, but also look at how we can start new worshipping communities and plant new churches across the diocese.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Yes, Duncan.
How did you get from 8 to 300 and whatever it was? I know you got 14 that came up, so what's the balance from 8 to 300? Because when I worked in Newcastle, I occasionally went into St Thomas's and it was just like a museum. That's what it was. There was even an exhibition centre in it, I seem to remember. But they didn't seem very live, although admittedly that was on a weekday, not on a Sunday. But how did you get from 8 to 300 up?
Great question. So I think last Sunday was particularly hard just because it was our first Sunday and we had baptisms. But nevertheless, we have grown significantly. There was just before the summer when we were redoing our small groups, including children and young people. It's about 200 people in midweek small group communities. I think I don't know if I couldn't give you a particular magic formula other than I think being present, praying. Nothing of lasting significance happens without prayer. Preaching the gospel. So
small groups as well, you refer to that?
Yeah, small groups. So midweek communities. We've done lots of alphas. If you've heard of Alpha, an opportunity to explore the Christian faith. There's a particularly high percentage of the congregation university students, so I think working to engage the students. If I'm honest, I think it's, again, back to the title of the talk, just proclaiming the gospel afresh in each generation. And so more people are likely to respond to the good news of Jesus if we preach the good news of Jesus. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen lots. But it is the most amazing, isn't the good news of Jesus, the gospel, the story of the life of Jesus, the most amazing thing that has ever been told. When I was sharing with these two girls on Thursday at church, they'd never heard the good news of Jesus told to them before. And they were in tears hearing it. And I think in a world where people tend to think that we're very secular, I just think that secularism is another form of religion. So every religious worldview, as you know, says that you've got to do something in order to earn your place in heaven. So you've got to do something in order to earn God's love. Or you've got, the balance. Does your good outweigh your bad, and then you might get into heaven depending on what religious worldview you follow. Secularism is really no different. So if religion is all about your performance, secularism is the same. So working with our university students, they're under so much pressure to perform, but they've got to create their own sense of identity, they've got to create their own sense of self-worth, which is just another form of religion. What the gospel offers though, religion says earn your life, liberal society says create your life. Jesus Christ says my life for your life. So your identity is received rather than achieved. It's the most liberating thing that has ever been talked of by the human mouth and the human lips. It is so freeing. It stops you from getting caught in a never-ending cycle of having to prove yourself and earn your identity and prove yourself to others. And I think, we know from the New Testament, don't we, that's either really attractive to people or it's really offensive to people. And lots of our young people in particular have never been to church before but have started coming to church. And I don't know why, but that's the message that we share. Lots of them have become Christians.
Bob? And then,
do you think then that that's to do with society's values? Values, let's just talk about politics, but values have been lost in what people think, never mind what they believe. People don't have values and don't hold firm to things like they used to in terms, because there's so much out there, social media, etc. I like the phrase when you say, we bring the gospel, we bring the truth of Jesus Christ, and you're not going to change it. But do you think that is part of what Duncan was asking you? Do you think it is because you're being true to what you and real to the message?
I think so, yeah. I think people do have values, they're just not explicit. But, to have a value of, to take what one student said to me earlier this week when I was talking to them outside church, don't all religions lead to the same place, for example? Well, that in itself is a doctrine and a dogma. It's a very emphatic statement. All religions lead to the same place. So everybody has these really held, firm values that people hold on to. Christians have always been, the church has always grown when it's been distinct from the culture that it's trying to reach. So the fastest growing church in the world today is in Iran, where it's illegal to be a Christian, where people are routinely whipped and imprisoned for taking communion. The fastest growing church in the world is in Iran. When historians look at why the early church grew in the way that it did, so much in the Roman Empire, it's because they held such a different series of values to everybody else around them. Everybody in the Roman Empire was a polytheist. You worshipped whatever god was worshipped in Corinth or Philippi, or if you were a Roman citizen, you declared Caesar as Lord, but would often pay homage to these other gods. The Christians were different, because they did not say Caesar is Lord. They said there is one God and Jesus Christ is Lord. The early Christians, one Roman emperor wrote to some of his advisors and said, why is it that these Christians, we can't shut these churches down? And one of his advisors wrote back and said, well, these godless Galileans, they don't just feed their own poor, they feed ours as well. And so it's just this idea of this distinct group of people who declare Jesus as Lord, living a distinct life, loving everybody regardless of who they are, while holding forth the truth that there's one name under heaven by which we can be saved, and it's Jesus. And I think that's it. You know.
I think we've probably got time just for another 2 questions.
Ben, it'll cost a lot of money to get to where you are today. Did most of this money come out of the Archbishop's fund you referred to?
Yes, great question. So the National Church have put in the most amount of money. The DBF have put in some, so Diocesan Board of Finance. And then there's a lot of pressure on, this is the thing you can pray for me for, there's a lot of pressure on us at St Thomas's to raise a lot of money as well. So by October 2024 we're supposed to be self-sufficient, so all of the money that the National Church has invested, we've got to be self-sufficient by. So to put that into some perspective, that means us getting to an annual budget of around £400,000 in giving in every year, starting with 0 in October 2019. So there's a very steep giving profile that we have to try and keep up with and match at St Thomas's. We're ahead of target at the minute. The congregation are being very generous, but obviously it gets steeper and steeper the further we've got to go. But I think, God's good and it'll be. But yes, most of the funding, particularly the real rooms, come from the National Church. So the National Church have put in around about £2 million into it.
Okay, just one last question.
I'm speaking very, very personally, very emotionally, because the movement that you're part of is blessing my family in Worcester and in Paynton, which is exciting and great. Is there a danger, though, that St Thomas's just becomes a student church? And what happens when the students go away? And is your morning service as lively as last Sunday evening?
So most of the students, that was our first evening service that you came to last week. So the morning service was 3 times the size of the evening one last week in terms of numbers. So before the pandemic, we were definitely very student heavy. So when the pandemic hit, 80% of the church family just disappeared off down south or all over the world. For lockdown. Back then we only had 2 children in the church family. I think last week there was 30 of them on Sunday morning. So the demographics definitely have changed. Because we're a city centre church, you obviously get more transitional congregation. I think the average city centre church in the Church of England has a 30% turnover every year in terms of new people coming in, other people moving. So that is obviously a challenge. But there's definitely a much bigger, stable core that are students now than there were 3 years ago. And I think being at St Thomas's will help, because we've been meeting at St Hilda's in West Jessamine for the past best part of 2 years, where there was no room for youth, there was no room for kids groups. We only had the church on a Sunday afternoon. Whereas now being at St Thomas's, we've got multiple rooms. So we had 4 kids groups on Sunday morning for the first time. And we're able to launch toddler groups in the week. We have a youth service every Tuesday night now. And so those kinds of things will help. But yes, because of our location, I think we're always going to have quite a few students checking us out. And I always tell people, people think of Resource Church and they go, they're only here for young people. We've got a significant number of over 70s now worshiping at St Thomas's. And we believe that the gospel of Jesus is for everybody. The gospel doesn't see an age. It doesn't see a lot. It doesn't see a background. Well, it does see all of that. But it doesn't care. The good news of Jesus is for everybody, regardless of who we are or where we're from. And so it's irrelevant to me somebody's age. I just want people to know the life that can be found in being part of church community and through the story of Jesus.
One last question.
No, you can't, I'm sorry. So thank you very much, Ben. If anybody has got a question which they haven't had the opportunity to ask, I'm sure Ben will be around for another few minutes after we finish, and do follow him then. Thank you so much, Ben, for taking time out of what's been a very busy schedule. You're just relaunching the church. So thank you for coming on and sharing with us something about what you've been doing and what you're hoping to do. Thank you.